Bachman, and I work in the Adult Programs Department here at the Ridgefield Library. We were very pleased to have Dr. Nick Bellantoni come and talk about his new book, Hiking Ruins of Southern New England. I wanted to remind you that you can buy books for sale and signing afterwards, and we have refreshments and some membership materials for the Ridgefield Historical Society. So I'd like to introduce you to Executive Director of the Ridgefield Historical Society, Stephen Barkas, who will introduce Dr. Bellantoni.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for attending today's presentation, Hiking Ruins of Southern New England, which is being co-sponsored by the Ridgefield Historical Society, Books on the Common, and the Ridgefield Library. Thank you to our friends at the Ridgefield Library for allowing us to use this beautiful space this evening, and thank you to Books on the Common for providing copies of Dr. Bellantoni's book, which are available for purchase at the back of the room this evening. And please also join us for a reception after the presentation. We have complimentary refreshments on the back table. For those of you who are not familiar with the Ridgefield Historical Society, we are an independent nonprofit organization founded in 2001 with headquarters in the historic 1714 Scott House on 4 Sunset Lane. Our purpose is to preserve, interpret, and foster public knowledge of Ridgefield's historical, cultural, and architectural heritage. I invite all of you to get involved in the Historical Society by becoming members or volunteers. Membership contributions are the primary means by which we fund the important work that we do for the community. From our National Park Service Battle of Ridgefield Archaeology project, where we're researching the history of the battle through archaeological investigations, please contact me if you have a property that you would like to be considered for this study, to the forensic analysis of the skeletal remains found on the battlefield, which the Historical Society is spearheading, to our production of the Battle of Ridgefield reenactment on Main Street every 5 years. Save the date for the 250th anniversary in April of 2027, and our educational programming for Ridgefield students at the Peter Parley Schoolhouse, the Witness Stones project that teaches 8th graders about enslaved residents, the Ridgefield LGBTQIA+ oral history project, where we are preserving the diverse stories of our residents, our restoration of the historic 1872 Branchville Schoolhouse into a community meeting and exhibition space, the Historic Resource Inventory project, documenting over 300 new properties in town, the Ridgefield History Club, which meets monthly to discuss the town's history, our student scholarships and paid summer student internships, and our many community events like tonight's presentation. So for tonight, our guest this evening needs no introduction. Dr. Nicholas Bellantoni, his name is familiar with Ridgefielders who have been following the saga of the 4 skeletal remains discovered on the site of the Battle of Ridgefield. Then just about to retire as state archaeologist, he spent several cold days in a dirt basement in Ridgefield painstakingly uncovering the remains of 4 young men believed to have been soldiers. Dr. Bellantoni now serves as Connecticut State Archaeologist Emeritus at the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History and is an Associate Research Professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Connecticut. He received his Ph.D. in Anthropology from the University of Connecticut in 1987 and was shortly thereafter appointed the 2nd Connecticut State Archaeologist. He is a former president of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and the National Association of State Archaeologists. And I am personally grateful to have been one of Dr. Bellantoni's many students at UConn, where he encouraged my passion for history and archaeology and made a lasting impact on my life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bellantoni to Ridgefield.
Thanks, guys, and it's great to be back to Ridgefield. I was telling Stephen, if he didn't mention that he was one of my students, I was going to mention it. So we're really proud of him, and we're so glad he's here with you and with the Ridgefield Historical Society. Now, as he says, you're probably more familiar with me in the recent history of the the skeletal remains that we are in the process of doing the forensic analysis on right now. We've got a number of research laboratories we've been working with around the country. We have been working very closely with the United States Army Department of Cemeteries. And so we're really moving forward now, and the Historical Society has been so helpful to us in terms of obtaining grants and so forth to get this analysis completed, so we could really determine who these young men are, and certainly if they are victims of the Battle of Ridgefield, hopefully to tell who they might be even individually and so forth. You know, our goals are to learn as much about their life histories through their skeletal remains as we possibly can. So we're working on that. I know a lot of you might have questions on it. We'll answer those if you have it, but primarily just know that we're still in the process. There's a lab work has already proceeded and will be proceeding through the summer and fall, and you know, hopefully we'll have some results to share with you sometime in the early spring, and maybe even with your, you know, the anniversary of the 27th anniversary of the battle. Somehow I got to fit in trails to this. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do all of that. But, so yeah, actually, you know, so you know me for Revolutionary War burials and much of my work here with Native American archaeology and other things. But this kind of slipped into my, you know, my back pocket, so to speak. My colleague, Barbara Ann Kipfer, who is an archaeologist and had done a trail book for Falcon Guides, and they came to her and said, would you do a trail book on archaeological sites that are associated with trails people take and so forth? And she realized that she wanted my assistance on it, and so that's how I got involved. And you know, basically as a state archaeologist, I've been all over Connecticut, and you know, I've been on a lot of trails, I've done a lot of hiking, and I've seen a lot of ruins, and I've had people to ask me about stone ruins in the woods and so forth that they have encountered. And so I started thinking, no, this is maybe a good thing. We could tell the history, we could bring them on the hike, give them some sense of what they're looking at, and appreciate the history. But there was another concern I had, and that had to do basically with the etiquette of archaeological sites. And, you know, I didn't want to tip anybody off that might want to vandalize an archaeological site, you know. And I kind of had a grope with that, you know, whether, you know, I wanted to really reveal where these places are. But what we ended up doing is coming to a kind of a compromise in the sense that there's no private property. These are all established trails on state parks, town parks, and so forth, and you know, overseen by trail associations. And there are ruins out there that are absolutely fantastic. So what we wanted to be sure is that, you know, along with telling the stories and how to get there, all of the, you know, the GPS readings and everything, but, you know, to put something in there about etiquette at archaeological sites. Be good stewards of the past. Don't take artifacts. Don't pick anything up. Don't walk on stone structures, you know. They are fragile. You can not only get hurt, but obviously you'll be destroying a cultural resource in the project. So some very careful things. Be careful where you're stepping and so forth, and think about what you leave behind. And, you know, I thought that was important to put in because, again, these are archaeological sites, and archaeological sites, you know, I've spent a career trying to preserve them here in Connecticut, and they're fragile and they're irreplaceable, just like you're learning in town with the burials, irreplaceable, and they could be easily destroyed or mishandled very quickly. So I also put a little thing in there about laws and being good stewards, and that there is a state archaeologist in every state. Now the book concerns Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. So it's southern New England and the 3 states there. But we also give you information if when you're out there and you find something, who to report it to. So you at least have that as a background. So we wanted to get that. And a couple of things on the tips of the book, for those that you're interested or wanting to go out, is really the best time to go out there is not now. You can, some of them are visible. But the problem is vegetation. the summer vegetation, the spring summer vegetation, the growth sometimes covers some of the ground vegetation will cover some of the historic stone ruins. And you want to be able to get as good an appreciation. And plus it's hot out there. So November to April, if the weather is good, these are really the best times to be able to visibly see everything. And you know, some of the trails, what I do in the book is I just take you to the ruins and get you home, okay? I don't take you on a complete tour that's available. Most of these trails go on, they can go on for miles, and they're wonderful trails. So what the book is kind of gets you to the ruins, interpret the ruins for you, how to observe them when you're out there, but also, it's, you know, we encourage you to appreciate the rest of the beauty of the landscape and the natural environment that's there, and hopefully you'll be able to do that. The chapters are grouped so that trails that are nearby each other follow each other. So in some cases, you might be able to get 2 trails or 3 trails in a given day if you have the energy and the desire. We give all the, you know, the miles, the time it should take. The problem with all of that is that we encourage you to explore. We want you to get out there and explore and look at the ruins from different viewpoints, along with following our narrative of what you're looking at. But we want you to do that, and so measurements may vary because of the time you may spend at each particular ruin. And listen, the trails are, you know, they have wonderful picnic areas. Many of them are family friendly. Bring the kids. Just have a good time. Hiking is good for you, and it's enjoyable, and these trails will really help you to do that. And there are loop and back and forth trails that you'll see. So the organization is a typical trail book if you've ever seen these. It's got route maps and overview maps and distances and difficulties of the trail surface. You know, we give you ideas. Most of these, by the way, are really easy trails. They're not very strenuous in terms of steep climbs, though there are a couple of those. But for the most part, they're pretty easy. Whether you can bring your dog or not, you know, we give you all of that. The driving and directions, the GPS coordinates. But the most fun, that was all the technical stuff. But the most fun for me in doing the book was writing the histories, because the histories are behind these ruins, in some cases, are so cool and so interesting. And of course, we describe the hike for you. So 40 trails in the book, and as you can see, they're very skewed to the state of Connecticut. Can't imagine why. But I did get some heat from my colleagues in Rhode Island and said, you only put 2 in Rhode Island. But if we ever do a second volume, we'll make sure we cover Rhode Island a little bit better than we did. But up in the Berkshires, there's some wonderful trails I'll be talking about, and other places. But primarily, we're doing Connecticut. And I'm going to start you with, and there's my legend. But what I'm going to do is, we're going to run through a series of them, of trails, tell you a little bit about the history. I thought I would start with this one because this is in the book, and it's right in your neighboring town of Reading. The Israel Putnam Park Trail. You've all been to Israel Putnam Park, I'm sure. It's a wonderful trail. And really, whether you realize it or not, when you're taking this loop, there are 8 archaeological sites at this trail. And as you loop around it, you're really seeing some amazing Revolutionary War history. You know, Israel Putnam, this was the winter camp for the Connecticut militia in 1887, 89. It was a very difficult winter encampment, and one of the soldiers that were out here in Reading was also earlier at Valley Forge. And he said in his writing that the conditions in Reading were much more difficult than at Valley Forge. It was a harsh winter. They had trouble getting food in and out, and so forth. Now, the reason there's Revolutionary War camps there is because Israel Putnam was assigned and ordered by George Washington to develop an encampment. The idea for that encampment was to protect the arsenal up in Danbury, which of course was attacked and coming through Ridgefield after they blew it up, the Brits blew it up, leads to your battle in town. But also it's a strategic location where they could get to Long Island Sound or to the Hudson River with the idea of protecting West Point if that should come under fire. But there are 8 archaeological sites. General Putnam, I don't know if you know about this guy is one of the great characters of Connecticut history. He's supposedly, when he was a kid, he killed the last wolf in Connecticut in a cave in Brooklyn, Connecticut, where he was born. But he was a veteran of the French and Indian War. When the call came that the Brits and the Patriots had clashed arms in Lexington and Concord, he put a militia together and ran up to Boston and took part in the Battle of Bunker Hill. So he really organized much of the Continental Army from Connecticut, and as a result, Washington put him in charge of the whole thing. And it is called often the Valley Forge of the North. So if you go to the camp, and I'm sure you've already been there, you'll notice a series of these rock piles that look like this. What those rock piles are what we call firebacks. And what they are the ruins of collapsed chimneys from enlisted men's huts. These huts were, 12 feet by 16 feet. There were 116 enlisted men huts at the park. And if you go, and as you go along the trail in the roadway, you'll see a whole series of these coming through. These are where each of the huts were located. The officers were up on the hill. That's where they had their huts. So, when you go back to the societies back then, there was strict social differences, and militarily and in many cases socially within the group. So the officers got the high ground, the enlisted men in the low ground. It was symbolic as well as the status of what is there. But these huts are very important. And in fact, they have received a great deal of archaeological attention over the years. Going back to the 1970s, the University of Connecticut, under the direction of David Poirier, a colleague of mine, actually did excavations here. Boston University did work here back in 1990. Some of you may know Dan Cruson. He was a long-time town historian in Newtown. He and Kathleen von Jena excavated there at the turn of the 21st century. We've also located middle camps that Western Connecticut State University has done work in. And I'm going to tell you one story about the archaeology, because there's 100 of them, but this one really gets me. We've got all these documents of the hardship, the difficulty of the food, getting food in. The roads were muddy and they couldn't get in and out, and the hardship. And there was a mutiny. Some of the soldiers, wanted to get out and just abandon this army and these harsh conditions in Reading. And we knew about that kind of suffering from the records. But when they excavated one of the huts and firebacks, they found bones of the animals that they were eating, and the bones were horses. Now, we don't normally eat our horses, but in times of starvation and difficulty, so it's one thing, to me as an archaeologist, it's one thing to read about that in a book, but it's another thing to see the physical evidence of it, in the fact that they were butchering their own horses in order to survive. Suburban Park, this is in Farmington, Connecticut, a little bit farther for you, but this is kind of cool because what this is the ruins of an amusement park at the turn of the 20th century. So Unionville is in Farmington along the Connecticut River, and it was the terminus, the final stop of the Hartford Suburban Trolley Line. The trolley line went from downtown Hartford up what is today Farmington Avenue, down Route 4 to Unionville. So this was, and this started like in 1895, and the trolley lasted right into the American Depression, economic depression in the 1930s. So the trolley bosses, this company decides, why don't we develop an amusement park at the end of the trolley line? This way, on weekends when traffic is not as much, we'll get some city folks to come out to the country and the suburbs and enjoy the day. And we'll make money on the trolley ride. So that's what they did. They developed, swimming pool areas. They had, a punting park, skating, one of the earliest electric-run water fountains. They had carousels, dance pavilions, ice cream parlors, restaurants. And another cool thing about where this is located, there are geological kettles glacial kettles. I don't know if you know what that is, but as the glaciers were receding, as they were pulling back, calves of large chunks of ice, the size of this building, if not bigger, bombed onto the ground. And when the soil was sandy and that ice eventually melted, those blocks of ice melted, they created these cone-shaped depressions that we call kettles. They're just so cool. You got some dramatic ones out here. But this is neat because this is right here, this is a photo of the electrified water fountain. Again, it's one of the earliest electrified water fountains in the country. This is what the ice cream parlor ruins look like. I searched for some ancient ice cream cones, but I couldn't find them. They must have deteriorated. And they had a dance pavilion, a huge pavilion at the top of the very top of the hill. That's a historic photograph from the Farmington Historical Society of what it looked like. And here are the ruins that you see. Eventually, when the park closed down around 1906, a Hawley family came in and they used the pavilion, rebuilt it, used the foundations and so forth for their house. But this was a really neat, active amusement park and completely gone. It's like a ghost town. Walt Landgraf Trail, this is in Peoples State Forest, Barkhamsted, Connecticut. We have about 4 sites in Barkhamsted. I'm so partial to it, unfortunately. But this is one of our real good Native American trails. And what it is a quarry site of steatite or soapstone that Native Americans made bowls and other kind of tools out of. And it has a huge rock shelter site that was excavated going back to 1900. Walt Landgraf actually found the site, him and another amateur archaeologist by the name of Andrea Rand, when they were walking, doing some work around the rock shelter, and they found these outcroppings of steatite with bowl shapes in them. And that, of course, led to more archaeological research, which shows that there were 2 periods of occupation. The earliest one, 4,000 years ago, where they were using and quarrying the soapstone for bowls and other kind of artifacts. This is what the rock shelter looks like. It's basically an outcropping of bedrock that provides a ledge, but it provides a nice shelter especially for groups moving around, hunting and gathering. And almost all of these in Connecticut have archaeological sites associated with it. Yale University recognized the significance of this and in the 1930s started to conduct some scientifically controlled excavations. And what was interesting here is that in the rock shelter, when they did the excavations, they actually found steatite tools, picks, quarrying picks, and steatite fragments. But they had no idea back then, if you read the report, that there was even a quarry nearby. And that's when we found the quarry, or I should say Walt and Andrea found the quarry back in 1995. And so if you look at this, what you're looking at is an outcropping of steatite or soapstone, soapstone is a very soft material. So it's pliable and it can be shaped very easily. And what you're looking at still in the bedrock is kind of the underside of a bowl. And what they would do, they would have cracked this out and then carved out the interior of the bowl. And some of these are, like I call them cereal bowls. Some are about like this big. Others, it would hardly fit on this podium. Okay? The radiocarbon dates gave us 2 different series of dates. So it was occupied at 2 different time periods. The trail takes you right through that. In fact, the significance of it now, the State Historic Preservation Office and the Barkhamsted Historical Society are now building, I think it's finished by now, but they started it this spring. They're building a pavilion so the hiker can come down past the rock shelter to the quarry, have interpretive signs reading about the quarry, and oversee some of the stone bowls that are still being carved on the wall from 4,000 years ago. Just amazing sight. And with the new interpretation and the pavilion, it's going to be a very educational tool among it. In Rocky Hill, Connecticut, we have Dividend Park. This is another one of my favorites because this really is one site that you could hike that will take you through 300 years of water-powered industrial ruins, the old mills, and they go back from the earliest corn mills of Gershom Buckley back in the mid-17th century. There are 3 loops, 2 short ones, a long one. There are 2 beautiful ponds, an upper and a lower pond, separated by stone dams from the mills. There are, let's see, here you go, 2 mill ponds, as I mentioned. You've got 4 dams and 10 industrial archaeological sites on this walk. You're never going to see anything quite like it anywhere. My dear friend June Cook, who is now passed, she founded our Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, her and her husband Dave. She lobbied very strongly to preserve this area as an industrial archaeological site because of the fact that it was being proposed for development within the town. We testified to it. The town and the state got together and they preserved it as open space and as a park with trail environment. So one of the trails is the June Cook Trail, so I always like to highlight her. Gershom Buckley built a corn mill here in 1677. Now, Gershom Buckley was the second congregational minister for Wethersfield. Wethersfield is just to the north, if you know it, and Rocky Hill was a part of the Wethersfield colony back in the 17th century. Gershom Buckley was not only an industrialist and a minister, he was a surgeon, he was an alchemist, he was a jack of all Renaissance trades. He did everything. He was one of the geniuses of the 17th century, and one of his great claims to fame is he was one of only 2 voices in the 17th century, him and Jonathan Winthrop the Younger, that testified against the witch trials. He thought the whole thing was absurd, and he testified against it, and he may have saved more than one woman's life by testifying against this kind of action. You don't read about that, but he was influential. And he developed the corn mill. And we have the ruins of that corn mill, along with you can see the millstone right there. Not only that, in the 1800s, the waterfall that comes down from the upper pond to the lower pond is very powerful, and it was powerful enough to operate a good forge. So there are factories, ruins there that, you know, they made edge tools, chisels, hoes, axes. In 1866, an Englishman by the name of Joseph Laurie produced what the first ever never slip horseshoe. You know, horses slipped on ice and snow, and this was a huge technological upgrade, and it made them pretty rich. But never slip horseshoes at Dividend Park. When this was when the whole area was coming under possibility of being developed, we went out there with our volunteers and we conducted excavations at the William Sage Butler and Robert Sudden factory. Back in the 1850s, they made scissors and cutting tools, and you can see some of the artifacts we recovered. The place burned down, it was destroyed by fire. They rebuilt it and started making some other products like cast iron banks and children's tools and so forth. But we wanted to be able to testify to the town and the state that there were archaeological resources here, and that as a result, the property and the site needed to be protected. The last of the factories was Billings and Edmonds. It was actually, the factory leads up here. Here's really a beautiful waterfall, getting the flow, turn the factory gears and the belts by this time, late 19th century. This was the very last one of the mills in Dividend Park, chronologically. Gay City State Park in Hebron, Connecticut. This was worth the trip, guys. Another one of my favorites. Gay City State Park. This was the home of a Methodist congregation. They kind of were not, seen, how do you want to say, the Congregationalists in town did not want the Methodists. So this is north of the town, the center of Hebron. And the Methodists were known at that time for dancing during their services. They also binged on alcoholic spirits during their services. This was very much frowned upon back then. And of course, but they operated, and they were very much involved in the Industrial Revolution. So today, this is what's called North Street or Route 85 in Hebron, coming out at Hebron Center, leading up to Manchester area. This was called Eastbury Road historically. This was a major intersection. Today it's Gay City Park Road, but you hike along what was once the historic Eastbury Road that takes you through. That road led to the Connecticut River and the town of Glastonbury. What was important about it is it allowed for not only merchants and commerce to go through, but the Gay City area was used for charcoal burning. So they were able to get the charcoal to get to the mills to the northwest part of the state for the old iron furnaces through this route. And also trees that were cut were transported down here to the Connecticut River for the shipbuilding industry that were going on the Connecticut River. So this was a key place. And Reverend Sumner had his house right on the corner, and we take you through a series of mill ruins, house ruins, cemeteries, and so forth. It started being settled in the mid-18th century, and it was called Great Farmsden, because basically it was farmland. In the 19th century, it would be called Factory Hollow, because of all the mills that were there. And then eventually in the 20th century, we refer to it as Gay City. Again, it had a Methodist community, sawmills, textile mills, blacksmith shops, whole communities, sire presses. Many of these have archaeological ruins. And of course, I mentioned the dancing and the spirits. And the thing here with this also is, according to legend, there were 2 murders committed here, all right? Supposedly a jewelry trader, merchant, was killed by a charcoal collier doing the charcoal, and the body of the jeweler was found in a charcoal hearth. And another murder occurred by the blacksmith in town. He had a young apprentice. His young apprentice showed up late for work one day. Evidently, the blacksmith was so enraged, he ended up killing him. I tell young kids, don't be late for work anymore. Now, I have to tell you, this is legend. We have no historic documentation. There are no court records. There are no arrest records. We have nothing to document, but it's part of the legends of Gay City State Park. It later becomes abandoned, and the property is purchased by 2 women, Alice and Emma Foster. They were unmarried sisters living in West Hartford, and they developed they bought the whole property after it was abandoned, and it became their summer home or lodge. There's a cemetery there, we call it Gay City Cemetery. It's very small. The stone wall was built by the state of Connecticut when they cleaned things up, and the nice clean roads were replaced by the state of Connecticut. So we do not know the full extent of this burial ground. It could fairly much precede a much larger area than what is delineated, but it's been kind of cleaned up for public consumption. This was Charles Sumner, who was Henry Sumner's son. He developed a paper mill in the 1870s, and this is a magnificent ruin. It is very long lengthwise and very shallow widthwise. It was long, like that table back there, simply because the machines were long. And when I first came here back in the 1980s or 70s, this is, by the way, the water would have come from the pond down here, drop through a shaft onto here. This is where the water wheel would have been. It would have been an undershot wheel where the water came through from underneath. When I first came out here back in the 80s, you could actually find on the side of the mill ruin, on the ground, you could find buttons, wooden buttons, bone buttons, some glass buttons, and those were from rags and shirts they were breaking down into paper. Those mounds were still there, and you could, last time I went back, we couldn't find them anymore, so somebody must have cleaned them up, obviously, but some of those kind of artifactual associations are still there. This is Jerusa Porter's House Foundation. This is along the trail also. Porters were, along with the Sumners, were the two main families in the settlement. This is Theodore Porter's House Foundation. This is kind of interesting because there's no center stack. There's no chimney stack here. This never had a fireplace. This was built after the invention, if you will, or the availability of wood-burning stoves. Wood-burning stoves were far more efficient in radiating heat than those old colonial fireplaces where most of the heat went up to shoot. So this is a classic architectural structure from the mid-19th century, indicative of wood burning. And this classic fireplace with a tall stack sits up on the ground, and this is a summer lodge that was built in the 20th century, early 20th century, by the Foster sisters. The ruin is still there. There's no foundations in terms of a cellar, because this was a summer home. This was only used for the summer, and so there was no, but you could still see the sills on the ground and actually delineate the outline of the lodge that was there. When they died, when the last sister died, it was stipulated in their will that the land would go to the state of Connecticut for the purposes of a public park and the protection of wildlife. But they also insisted that the park be called Gay City. The gays, while they were there, you know, we have them in the Landys and stuff, but they were one of the minor families. They weren't like the Sumners or the Porters. So we don't know why they stipulated it, but that's what it's going to be called. This is even cooler. Coogan Farm, Mystic, Connecticut. You must have been down to Mystic by now. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful places, along with Ridgefield in Connecticut. And you know, you got the river, you got the seaport. It's just the little town. Well, okay. To the north of the seaport, immediately north of the seaport, you've got the Mystic River here, Route 27, I-95 would be up here. You take Route 27 to go to Mystic Seaport and the village. You've probably passed it unknowingly if you've been down this road, and you've passed the Coogan Farm Trail, which is part of now a farm and heritage center. And it just gives you a whole history going back to Native Americans, because Native American stone tools have been found in the plowed fields here that date back thousands of years ago. But the walls here are all part of the farm. But the real big highlight is a mansion ruin at the top of the hill. So the land goes back to the, you know, the early, really 17th century, when Captain John Gallup received 500 acres for his service during the Pequot War. The Pequot War was 1636, 1637. It's a long story about the war. But he served the Connecticut militia, and what they did is they gave away Pequot land to, you know, the officers that were involved in the British, the English officers, or the American officers now, if you want to call it. So this property had been farmed literally for over 350 years. These are the stone steps, and actually we used this photograph for the cover of the book. I didn't know I was such a good photographer until I started doing this. But these are beautiful stone steps, and what that does is it comes down into the barn. They had the Coogan family actually were the latest farmers here. They didn't develop a farm until 1918. And they were basically dairy farmers and had huge pastures for their cows. And this is one of the largest barn ruins of the early 20th or 19th century that I've ever seen in Connecticut. And you've got a historic image of what the barn looked like. There are stone walls here, and the stones in these walls, and some of them are yay high, and the stones some of the stones on the wall are, you know, how do you want to say, the size of the tables, the picnic tables out there. And you get an appreciation of why they call this area Stonington. Huge stones, and they use, I'm not going off track here, but they used cradles and leverage and slings to pick up these stones and put them on the walls, or even for the foundations of these barn ruins. It's an amazing technology without hydrology that they were able to do back then. But you see the evidence of it along the farmstead. But here is what you really want to go to see. At the top of the hill is the ruins of a mansion, the Stillman Mansion, that was never built. In 1888, Elizabeth, also called Charlotte, and her agreement, and her husband, Thomas Stillman, they purchased this property and the farm for the purposes of building their summer home. This is in the Gilded Age. This is when, you know, the wealthy of New York and Boston were building summer homes at Newport, Rhode Island, and other places along the Connecticut coast. You know, just summer mansions that, you know, the breakers and so forth. Well, the Stillmans wanted their mansion, summertime. They basically lived in New York City, but this was going to be their summer home to get out of the heat of New York during the summertime. So this would have been all cleared land. From the top of that hill, you not only could see the Mystic River, you would have been able to see the seaport, the village, and beyond. And the hills on the Groton side, it would have been magnificent. But what happened was that they started construction. They put the foundation down. It was supposed to be a 49-room mansion. But they started to run into some financial constraints. And so they stopped construction, figuring they would pick it up when things got a little bit better for them financially. Well, it never did. And in fact, both of them got sick and died very shortly thereafter. So the mansion was never built. And what you could see here is part of the foundation, plus a window would have been to look for light to get into the basement. This trail is set up so you actually can go down the stairs and go into the basement and walk around. And you can, you know, you could see how they built the thing. And there's, you know, areas where there would have been, you know, wine cellars and so forth. And it's so cool because, you know, you go to Newport and you go to the breakers, you don't go to the basement. And for an archaeologist, we want to see the basement. I want to see the cellar. I want to see how this thing is built. And anyhow, this is so unique. I know of no other site like it anywhere in the United States. Oh, Westwood's Trail, okay. This is the site of a railroad granite quarry that dates to the 1890s into the 20th century. And it supposedly is also the site of a 1,500-year-old Byzantine church of early Christendom. So I get a call at my office from a priest, a Roman Catholic priest in Chicago. And he says, listen, I just read an article that describes this Byzantine church in Connecticut. And I said, well, you know, to be honest with you, we don't have a Byzantine church in Connecticut that dates back to the early Christendom. He said, but they present such great evidence in this article. And I said, well, I have read the article, but they're very wrong with their interpretation. Tried to convince him. But he was so, he was an authority on Byzantine churches, had toured many of them, the ruins, the archaeological ruins of them in North Africa and the Middle East and so forth. And he says, I've got to see this. I've got to come. I said, well, man, come. I mean, you know, but I'm telling, you know, I don't want you to be disappointed because it's not. So he comes. I pick him up at Bradley Airport, and I'm trying to present my argument of what I think this is. And he he said, you know, he's listening very patiently and so forth, presenting why he thinks this might be true, and this would be such an amazing discovery. And I told him, look, I'm not against it. National Geographic could be knocking my door down if, if this was a Byzantine church, but it's just not. So anyhow, I brought him out there, and he actually took the trail you could take. And the first thing you do is you pass a granite quarry with a lot of blocks, grout piles, blocks of granite cut for the railroad. This was for the building of the railroad, bridges, embankments, abutments, and they purposely brought over Magumbanes. They brought over Italian masons to come in, immigrants to come in to work the stone, okay? And it's a magnificent quarry with a lot of quarry ruins. But if you go just maybe like a quarter, not quite a quarter of a mile, I want to say north of the quarry, you start finding stone carvings. A basin that's been interpreted as a baptismal font. A spewing fountain of stone carved into the stone. Some have said this might be flowers they interpreted, or a spewing flowers. This is what they considered the church altar. There was a flat area broken out here where that could have served as an altar for mass services. And there were puncture holes in the ground, in the stone, that they were interpreting as a candelabra. What these were, of course, is this is how you cut stone back then. You drilled holes. And they were probably training apprentices on how to do this stuff. So my interpretation to the priest was that all of these wonderful artifacts and things were actually built and carved. And there's a throne, there's a stone seat by the Italian masons on their lunch hour, probably. Us Italians were creative. We can't stand, I think these guys probably couldn't stand doing blocks all day long. Now they had an opportunity to express themselves. There's no other historic explanation for any of this stuff, and there have been no artifacts ever recovered here. But I maintain it's my Italian ancestors who did this. And the priest at the end of the tour, he said to me, I agree, Nick, it's not a church at all. This is nothing like what we see in the old world. And I said, thank you, but feel free to come back anytime you want. So speaking of quarries, here's another granite quarry. This is up in the Berkshires in Beckett. You go up Route 7, you know, and if you go up into the Berkshires, it's a quick drive to get to Beckley Quarry. And to me, this is really kind of neat because this is really an abandoned quarry. It began in the 1850s as the Chester Hudson Quarry. Fine grained granite, beautiful material. It was, you know, they started quarrying, mining here before the Civil War, and it finally closed down after the Second World War. But the trail you take actually starts at Quarry Road, and what you really are walking is the old granite roadbed that they haul the granite out of until you get to the top of the hill where the quarry is, and all this machinery is still around. And what I mean by that is there are still derricks and pulleys, there are trucks, there are compressors. The darn thing looks like these guys walked out of work one night and never came back. Everything is laying in place. It's like an outdoor museum to quarrying technology. And this was fine, and the quarry today is filled in with water that has come in now, groundwater. But this was, you know, finely carved. Almost every cemetery in the state in New England, with few exceptions, have monuments in them that were carved from the granite from Beckett Quarry. Statues, stone monuments, family tombs. It was so pliable and they carved it so specially, and you could still see the whole thing. There are grout piles around, you know, just stacks of granite that were getting ready to be processed or sent out. And my favorite along the trail is somebody painted a couple of eyes up there to keep watch over you from one of the grout piles. But there are trucks just laying there, rusted, going back to the 1940s and 30s, compressors, derricks. It is just it's just an outdoor museum. And I have to tell you, the people here, that the association, they do an extraordinary job. There are signages along the way interpreting the machinery you're looking at and how the operation of the quarry went. Just an outdoor museum, lost in time.
I'm sorry. What happened that it suddenly stopped?
To
The quarry, what made it suddenly stop?
the water.
No, I mean the operations.
Oh, they just stopped. They closed the doors. They went bankrupt.
Wow.
They just stopped work, and yeah, they basically went bankrupt. There were talk about having the quarry restored down the road in the 50s and 60s because there's still a lot of granite out there, but it never happened. And eventually, this is another property that was slated for economic development. They were going to put houses up here. And again, the local citizens created a land trust to be able to preserve it and maintain it as open trails and an outdoor museum. And the next town over from Becket is Chester, Massachusetts, along Route 20. And this has the Keystone Arches Bridge Trail. Super cool, because not only can you see an 18th century farmstead, you can see a 19th century engineering railroad feat that is remarkable, and a 20th century artist colony complete with a murder. And you walk right along the beautiful west branch of the Westfield River. So, the arch bridges. When the Erie Canal was built in the 1820s, okay, and it opened up, it allowed, obviously, produce, manufacturing goods to come from what was then called the Northwest Territory. We would call it the Midwest today, Ohio, Indiana, and so forth, was now able to get through, from Buffalo to Albany, following the Mohawk River, and then down the Hudson River to New York. New York really benefited economically. It boomed in the 1820s and 1830s because of the canal. Goods were going both ways. Markets were flying. It was very prosperous, and it was a boom to New York City. However, it was tragedy to Boston, because Boston was cut off of this economic traffic because of the Berkshires. You couldn't feasibly put a canal through the Berkshires and get this produce and everything, all this commercial enterprise to Boston. So Boston was going through some economic hardships, and they realized they needed some kind of transportation system to get goods here from the canal and Albany across Massachusetts. So they decided, as the railroad industry started to come in, that maybe they could put a railroad head from Albany to Boston going over the Berkshires. And they hired an engineer called George Washington Whistler. If the name sounds familiar, he is the father of James Whistler, who painted his mother, evidently. And, but he was an extraordinary engineer. And what he came up with, he believed that the best route to put a railroad over this mountain would be through the Westfield River, the west branch of the river especially. But the problem was the river meanders like crazy. And so to build a railroad through there required 27 overpasses and the construction of 10 arch bridges. Now when I say arch bridges, these are held together by a keystone, okay? No mortar. These are dry laid stone, finely cut so each piece fits on it, and this whole structure, and this is a double arch, is held together by the keystone that's set and really supports the whole structure. Amazing. And of course this goes back to Roman technology. I mean, they were doing this a long time ago. But that keystone, this is so effective that There are still railroad trains that go through this every day, and it still holds up. It's an amazing feat. This one, the double arch, is 70 feet high. When they finished it in the early 1840s, the whole thing was 150 miles from starting in Albany, from the Hudson River to Boston. At the time, at its day, it was the first railroad in the world ever to cross a mountain range. It was the highest and longest railroad ever built in the 1840s. It was an engineering feat that is unbelievable. And it's still there, and you could still see the stone arches. And it's just a monument to look at. And it's a very scenic walk. It's a trail that goes by the river. There are waterfalls. It's really beautiful. And then it takes you to this abandoned culture center, the Brookshire Culture Center. So here's the story. The story is that there was a very wealthy engineer, a very prominent engineer from New Jersey. His name was Charles Farmer. He was Hungarian. He married a Hungarian woman named Barbara Novaki, and she was a huge patron of the arts. And she talks her very wealthy husband into considering to build a colony, an art colony up in the Berkshires by the river, where artists and poets and writers and sculptors can all come together, commune, hobnob, enjoy the beauty, and be inspired for their artistic works. So they go ahead and start. He puts $150,000 in the 1960s toward the building of it. But he soon has suspicions that his wife is cheating on him. And he becomes very paranoid about it. And he thinks that this whole artist colony is nothing more than a place for her and her lover to escape to. And he is convinced that this is just a place for a tryst and nothing about colony and art. So they argue, there's verbal abuse, there's some physical abuse, they fight. She leaves the house. They actually have a mansion in New Jersey. They called it Marywood, and a castle. It was a castle motif. And she leaves, files for divorce. At some point, she gets a court order to go back into the house to get to the mansion, the castle, to get her clothes. She wants her wardrobe. So she goes back with her lawyer. Charles, meanwhile, has in this castle a number of secret passages. So he could get anywhere in a castle without being seen, and sometimes even spy on his guests if he wanted to. He takes the secret passage, comes into her bedroom unexpectedly from the wall with a gun in his hand, and he confronts her about her lover and her work. They start arguing. He fires. He shoots her 3 times in the chest. Then he takes the gun, he puts it in on himself, and he shoots himself. She dies immediately. He survives. He will eventually go to court. They'll find him mentally unfit. He'll serve some time in a state hospital, and then be released. He would die in 1975. But meanwhile, the Culture Center is abandoned. And it just sits there, and it's along the trail. There are no signages or so forth, but you have to read the book to learn the story. But how cool is that? Larry, I'll get to you in a moment after I finish, but we'll take some questions, because this way we can get through it, because I don't know how we doing.
You're good.
You're good? All right, Erie House ruins. Erie is another word for eagle's nest, right? So a guy by the name of William Street, just before the American Civil War, decides he wants to build a summer resort at the top of Mount Nonotuck, which is part of the Mount Tom Reserve. These are basalt ridges that go hundreds of feet into the air along in the Connecticut River Valley. And he actually builds a resort at the top of the hill, of the basalt ridge. So your walk is a climb all the way out, especially from here on. It's steep coming up and up to the top, but it's well worth it. Take your time if you need to. The good news is it's all downhill coming home. But you've got to get to the top in order to see the ruins. And what he did is he built this resort that overlooked the Connecticut River Valley, and for miles along the landscape. You could see New Hampshire and Vermont from up there. It's gorgeous. And you know, he built a hotel up there for people to stay. There were wooden promenades that people could walk and skate on and just take in the serenic beauty. You could play croquet, you could picnic, they had whole stables, dining rooms, and so forth. It was so successful by the 1880s, it was over 5,000 customers a year were coming up here to enjoy the ruins. For 25 cents, you can get into the place. For 50 cents, you could have dinner, and if you wanted to spend the night, it was $2. How are you going to beat that? Even in 1860, right? But he starts running into some financial problems. And one of the problems is he's getting to the 20th century, and the problem is that he's got competitors now. He's so successful, others want to now are building resorts. But they're building resorts now that are more up to date in terms of the technology and the changes that were occurring in the late 19th century. So he needs to regroup. He needs to attract new business by upgrading. So he starts to build a new hotel. He starts to build a number of different things. But the problem is before he can complete it, the whole place burns to the ground. What happened was he had 2 horses that died. Now, up on these basalt ridges, there are pockets of soil, but it's rock. And there's no place to bury horses. So what he had to do is he had to cremate them. He set a fire, he doused them after they died, and he burned them up. He oversaw it and thought the fire was out, went to bed, but he is awoken in the middle of the night with flames coming in through the house and the building, and he realized that embers had caught fire, and the place completely burned down. So he had to close the resort in 1901. He had no fire insurance, so he was out of business. The state of Massachusetts comes to him a few years later and says, we would like to purchase this to make this part of the Mount Tom State Reservation, which is a whole series of, basalt ridges that, have trails and so forth going through it. He refuses to sell because he feels that the state of Massachusetts is not giving him the appropriate money. So it's deadlocked, they can't come to an agreement, so the state took it by eminent domain. And now it is part of the Mount Tom State Reservation and allows you to go up and tour the ruins of the hotel and other factors there. This is as you come up the trail, the hotel, this was the hotel that was never finished. This is the new one that he was putting together, never finished. This is a same view of it from the top. There are, ruins of the horse pavilions and stables and so forth. So it's a neat site up there, and there are great ruins associated with this summer resort, but and is now part of the bit of a hike getting up. But once you're there, the views are beautiful, the vistas are beautiful, and a lot of great history there. Last one I'm going to do, guys, because I know I'm going on. This is in Groton, Massachusetts, not in the Berkshires, going closer to Boston, and it's Bancroft's Castle Trail. Now, William Bancroft, and there's the Historical Society has a photograph of it, he was going to build his house, his retirement house, in a castle theme. William Bancroft was, he was a general during the Spanish-American War. He was also, later on, the mayor of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he and his wife, when they retired, they wanted to build this, what they call Shawfield Mount, a castle-themed mansion with a large stable and so forth. Unfortunately, he only got far enough to do the bungalow. I'll show you, again, this is the picture. He never got to build his future castle that he wanted to. And this is called Giblet, we would call it Giblet Hill. The British would call it Gibbet Hill. Gibbet Hills were where they hung people back in England. Now, we have no historic records that anybody was hung here in Groton, Massachusetts, up on the hill, but it has the same exact name as the English. So I wanted to point that out to you. So he ends up selling it. He sells it, the property, to a doctor by the name of Ayers. He purchases the property as a tuberculosis sanitarium and a mental health place. He advertises it in the Boston Globe and in the Boston newspapers to the city folks to come on out to Groton. It's pastoral. It's beautiful New England. It's peaceful. It'll do wonders for your mental health, and the clean air will do wonders for your lungs and your diseases. And he operated it for about 7 years, but he too ran out of money. It was unsuccessful, and he closed it. Later becomes part of the Groton Hunt Club, and then eventually some boys were up on the hill near the castle where they were setting off fireworks for the 4th of July celebration. This was in 1932, and the fireworks got out of hand. The whole place burnt down. And what you see now are the ruins that are still, and the ruins are magnificent, as you could see. Not a very tall guy, but I come up to about here on this whole complex. It's really, really beautifully structured, and one of the really great trails. It's a very family-friendly trail. After the war, and the whole place, it was purchased by the Campbell family, and they owned the Atlantic Monthly magazine, which is a very major magazine in America, going back to the 19th century. When they all die, or when Marion dies, they decide to sell the property for development. They were going to propose put 75 houses up here. Again, the citizens of Groton and others campaigned against it. A local real estate agent, Stephen Weber, buys the property and converts it back to a working farm like it was in the 17th century. And he opens up the Giblet Hill Grill and Barn and makes it available for folks to, with the Groton open space, to do the trails and go see them. It's really got, you get up on that hill, you not only have the castle ruins, but you could see on a clear day, you could see, the White Mountains up in New Hampshire. You could actually see them from up there. Just gorgeous. And if you go up there in the fall, my goodness, it doesn't get any better than that in New England. So I'm going to end it with that. There are 40 trails. If I told you all 40, I didn't bring my pajamas, so I ain't staying any longer. But each one of them, every one of them is my favorite, because every one has a great story to tell, and the ruins are just magnificent. And we tried to do a diversity of it. But your bookstore, the Common, has books back there, and if you're thinking of or have friends or family that love to hike, let's put it this way: the Falcon Guides did a wonderful job on the book production. The writing stinks, but the production of the book is fabulous. All right, guys, thanks for having me.